Okay, let's continue talking about code style, and we'll talk about type declarations. The recommendation is to use predefined types instead of system types. So you use int instead of the system type int32. Use the lowercase string instead of the uppercase string, and you use bool instead of boolean. They actually both mean the same thing, but just pick a convention and stick to it. And Microsoft's recommendation is to use the predefined types. And now the keyword var, and this is an interesting one. My personal preference is I don't like var, but I'll give you the reasons why other people believe that I'm wrong. The biggest reason that I've seen is that it helps with readability because if you have those really long types, then it gets to be a whole lot of visual clutter. I would argue that to some extent, having the using statement remove the namespace from the type name helps that readability. But of course, there are really long class names as well, and that's the point of var is to eliminate those. There are also rules that go along with the use of var that indicate that you really need to be able to tell the type in the var statement. So if you have var variable name is equal to, that equal to should really tell you what the type is, so you don't have to guess. I see this rule violated all the time because the var typically is equal to some sort of expression that uses a method that has a return type, in which case you're dependent upon IntelliSense. I really don't like my source code to be totally dependent upon IntelliSense, so I try to avoid using var. I am actually in the minority in that. Have your team talk it out, make a decision, and be consistent with it. For organization, put only one class or interface or enum in a file. Try to avoid putting in multiple classes in a single file. It makes things confusing for other people when they try to find a class definition. And it's really good if the file name is actually equal to the class name. If you need to rename the class, you can rename the file, and Visual Studio will ask you if you want to refactor and rename that class name throughout the solution. Also, F2 will do a refactor rename, and that's your friend as well because it will take care of all the references. For namespaces, the recommendation is for the namespace to follow the format company.assembly_name .folder.subfolder if there are such. Again, this is one of those things that your team can agree on as to what their format wants to be. And this is another good controversial topic, how to work with curly braces. The Microsoft recommendation is for the curly braces to be vertical, so that we have that opening brace on a new line after the method declaration. Java, of course, has that opening brace typically on the line of the method definition. But C# prefers the vertical orientation. It makes the code longer, and some people will argue that they don't like the length. Other people will argue that it's easier to see code blocks that way. The other choice is what's known as Kernighan and Ritchie style, which originally comes from C and C++, and that has that opening curly brace on the same line as the method definition. And this is one of those things that, again, you want to be consistent on. Please don't mix these, because it makes the code really confusing to read if you have a mixture. Just pick one and stick with it. And if you're on the losing side of that argument, just work with it, you'll get used to it. And member declarations. We actually had a very long discussion about where members should be declared. Basically, we all agreed that they should either be on the top or the bottom of the class, but there was much discussion about whether it should be the top or the bottom. In the end, just make an agreement. And one of the arguments for not putting them on the top is they take up all the room in the top of the class. Put them within a region and then collapse that region. And then they won't take up all the space, but they'll be there so you can see them. If you put them in the bottom, still put them in the region, and that helps clean up the code a bit. With event handlers, there are two methodologies. One is the old traditional one that came out with the original C# and .NET code, where you would have a click event and you would create a new event handler and pass in the name of the method for the delegate. And then later on in the code, you would actually have that method body. You can now use a Lambda expression, and we'll talk about Lambda expressions later on in the course. So you can put that code in line with the click event. And that code within the click event can actually be a method name. So you could still run the basic idea of the old traditional version. And that's preferable if there's a lot of lines of code there. But if it's just like a short one-liner, in that case, the Lambda expression is a bit handier and cleaner than having a separate method for one line of code. But again, this is one of those things that you'd like to agree with your team as to how you're going to handle it. So these are some guidelines for you to work with, and they're a starting point. I certainly don't think that you should take these without taking a look at your own styles and the other members of your team, if you have a team, and their styles. The important thing is that you have consistency among yourselves and agreement among yourselves. Nothing is more miserable than having one person write up standards for everyone without any kind of discussion and enforce them rigidly. It makes for a really bad dynamic. Take these as a recommendation and work out your own.